I can't remember exactly when I first heard about the Vogel Award, but my friend told me about it many years ago, and I had always meant to enter the award. And I was working on this novel for quite a few years, and I was approaching 35, and I just got it to the stage where I felt it was ready to submit just in that year where I had just a few months to spare, so I just got in, luckily. And it is such a fantastic award. It's totally changed my life. Obviously, the $20,000 prize money is so generous and is just a gift to me. Now I can start working on my next book. And that is fantastic, but also the experience of working together with an editor and a proofreader on my manuscript, and with professionals going through every aspect of it. I learned so much from that about writing and about the whole publication process. But I think most of all, I think the most important thing about the Vogel Award is the recognition that it brings, and it gives me the permission to think about myself as a writer, and that's just my dream come true. I wasn't a huge fan of Kafka originally, but I happened to read this article in the New York Times in 2012, many years ago, about a court case surrounding these mysterious Kafka papers, and no one really knew what was in the papers, but they had come from this suitcase that Max Brod, Kafka's literary executor, had taken with him from Prague when he fled to Palestine at the beginning of the Second World War. And now these papers had been handed down, and they were in this dispute, and at the time of the article, they were in the possession of these two septuagenarian cat ladies who were keeping them in cardboard boxes in their apartment where they lived with, 80 cats. And so they felt like the papers were their private property. And then a German literary archive got involved, and the Israeli National Library, all of them were fighting over these papers, but nobody really knew what was in the papers. It could have been an unseen Kafka work or diaries or memoirs. And I just was so intrigued with this idea and with this story because the story is so Kafkaesque. It's just like the trial. And I just wondered, what is in there? And my novel is a kind of answer to that question. Yes, there was. When I first started researching for this book, I didn't know very much about Kafka. I'd read a few of his stories, and when I thought about Kafka, I thought about a man who was quite depressive, neurotic, tubercular. But when I started researching more about him, I found actually he wasn't like this at all. He was really charismatic, handsome, charming. He was very much into health and fitness, and he was into this early 20th century exercise craze, which is a bit like aerobics, and it was called the Miller technique. He was really into that. He was very successful at his job. He worked in accident insurance, and he developed various safety devices for factory workers, and he's even credited with inventing the civilian safety helmet, which is not what you think about when you think about Kafka. And then I found, when I started researching Max Brod, who I didn't know very much about at all, but he seemed to be a kind of ladies' man, very confident, very successful. He was this great arts patron, both in Prague and later in Israel as well. But then, when I researched about him, I found actually he suffered from this severe spinal deformity for which he had to wear this whole body harness as a child. And even that didn't stop him from developing a hunched back. So there was this kind of real reversal between the two images of the two men and what seemed like the reality. And I found this particularly interesting, considering how much of what we know about Kafka we only really know through Max, because the majority of Kafka's work was published posthumously by Max and often edited and finished by him as well. So I asked myself how much of what we think is Max is really Kafka, and how much of Kafka is really Max. Yes, it is. It's a mixture. The relationship between the two men is a mixture of fact and fiction. And it's true that Max was, in a way, Kafka's patron and he was his mentor. And if you think about Max's situation, he was a successful writer, and then suddenly here comes Kafka, who is a genius, you know, the voice of a generation. How would you feel if you were in this situation?